It's a great privilege to welcome Professor Peter Harrison today. He's the Andreas Idrios Professor of Science and Religion at Oxford University, where he took up the chair during his past academic year following the retirement of John Hedley Brooke. And Peter has already been a huge help to us, actually, in various Faraday activities, speaking in our courses. He's previously given one of our public lectures, and so we're delighted he could come now and give us a research seminar. Peter's interests, as I'm sure you'll know, particularly in the cultural and intellectual history of the 16th to 18th centuries. He's written widely in that area. He's got some great books. In fact, he's got a book out or about to come out? About to come out. This is a book which has been about to come out now for some time, entitled The Fall of Man and the Foundations of Science, CUP. It actually, I noticed, costs £50 today. We're privileged to have the Reader's Digest version, is it? The 1 hour version of the book, so you can have it today for only for less than £50. But do look out for that book when it comes out very soon. And we're delighted that Peter's then going to speak to us on the doctrine of the fall and the epistemological foundations of modern science. And while Peter comes up to speak, I am going to be closing these windows. Okay, so thanks, Peter, very much indeed.
Thanks, Dennis. It's always a pleasure to be here. And as Dennis said, there is a forthcoming book that I'll give a plug to. They actually have got the cover done. I think the reason the book hasn't appeared, it's got nothing to do with tardiness on my part. I think it's an RAE year, and that there's a bit of a backlog at the press. At least that's what the press tells me. So it should be in the shops before Christmas. But if I were you, I'd wait for the paperback, which hopefully will be less than 50%. I apologise if you can't see a handout. I had somewhat underestimated the audience. So not the intelligence of the audience, obviously, but the numerical quantity of the audience. But if you can't see this handout, don't worry, because every quotation that I will be speaking to will appear on the screen, except the very first one, which is rather extended. So you should get the whole story there. So what we're going to talk about today, as you can see, what role does the fall narrative and ideas about original sin, what role do they have in the foundations of modern science? And we're going to look at these 4 points. Firstly, the fall narrative in the 17th century generally. Then we'll talk about what its methodological or epistemological implications were. I'll say something then about specifically experimental natural philosophy or experimental science as practiced in 17th century England. And that will be the main focus of the talk today. And that's a fairly thin slice through the forthcoming book. So we'll be looking at one specific aspect of that book, the experimental approach to natural knowledge in the 17th century. And I'll spend, as I said, the first 2 points setting up this question. And then very briefly we'll come to look at how all of this might affect the way we think about the general approach that we've traditionally had to philosophy and science in the early modern period. So we start then with the fall narrative in the 17th century. My interest in this topic began when I was researching a previous book, which was on the Bible and science generally in the 17th century. And what I noticed there is that in a lot of the prefaces to scientific and epistemological works, there was reference to the fall and original sin. And this I found rather striking and thought, well, there must be something to this. So I began to keep a list of references to the fall in works of epistemology and works on scientific method. And I'm going to expose you to a few of those now, just so that you can see how prevalent this kind of fall talk was in these contexts. So if we take Robert South, Robert South was the Oxford orator. He spoke famously at the opening of the Sheldonian Theatre in 1668 and used the opportunity to criticise the Royal Society. But, as I said, this is the one quote you don't have. Let me just read what Robert South has to say about Adam. He came into the world a philosopher, that is to say, a scientist, which sufficiently appeared by his writing the nature of things upon their names. He could view essences in themselves and read forms with the comment of their respective properties. He could see consequence, yet dormant in their principles, and effects, yet unborn in the womb of their causes. His understanding could almost pierce into future contingents, his conjectures improving even to prophecy or the certainties of prediction. Till his fall, it was ignorant of nothing but of sin, or at least resisted in the notion without the smart of experiment. I confess, 'tis difficult for us who date our ignorance from our first birth, and were still bred up with the same infirmities about us, with which we are born, to raise our thoughts and imaginations to those intellectual perfections that attended our nature in its time of innocence. So Adam here is depicted as the perfect philosopher, with a perfect knowledge of the natural world, with a capacity to predict from the present state of affairs what would happen in the future, and self-contrasts our present condition with respect to knowledge to the condition that Adam had once enjoyed during his time in paradise before he fell. This was a typical view of the perfections of Adamic knowledge, and the perfections of Adamic knowledge were both held up as an aspiration for the present generation, and yet as an aspiration which in a sense it would be impossible to fulfil because of the limitations placed on our present knowledge as a consequence of the fall. Now, something of this we get in a figure who is more familiar in discussions of the foundations of scientific method, and that's Francis Bacon. And Bacon's well-known statement about what science is to be about: man, by the fall, fell from his state of innocency and from his dominion over the creation. Both of these losses can, even in this life, be in some part repaired. The former by religion and faith, and the latter by the arts and the sciences. For creation was not by the curse made altogether and forever a rebel. And in the last part, Bacon notes that not merely are the barriers to knowledge generated by the fallen condition of the human mind, but the natural world itself was cursed and became opaque to our attempts to understand it and investigate it. So nature also resists our investigation as a consequence of its fallen condition. Now, the Royal Society, which is founded in the 1660s, moulds itself explicitly on Baconian principles, and Robert Hooke, the first curator of experiments at the Royal Society, here is him making reference to the fall in the preface of his famous Micrographia. Every man, both from a derived corruption, innate and born within him, and from his breeding and converse with men, is subject to slip into all sorts of errors. And as we will see, I'll put this quotation up again later, Hooke is going to say, here is the human condition as a consequence of the fall. The solution to this problem lies in a particular approach to the natural world, as he will say. The experimental natural philosophy is the way to approach nature in light of what we know about the human condition as a consequence of the fall. Just a few other quick examples. Joseph Glanville, another early fellow of the Royal Society, he's attempting to ground epistemology, theories of knowledge, in a certain way. He says, apart from the general reason I gave for our intellectual disabilities, the fall, it'll be worth our labour to descend to a more particular account. So approaches to knowledge will typically say the fall is responsible for the errors that we have in our knowledge. We need, though, to go beyond this broad theological claim and investigate in detail what happened to the human mind and the human senses as a consequence of the fall in order to remedy the deficiencies that we then identified. And that's precisely what we're going to see in Glanville. John Sargent, another example. John Sargent is a critic of the experimental method. He's also a critic of the Cartesian approach to learning, but he's still got the same general approach. So the greatest minds fall short of true knowledge, which is their natural perfection, the Aristotelian reference, which I'll come back to. Our first inquiry should be, if we're going to talk about the foundations of knowledge and the foundations of science, how man's nature came to be able from performing his primary operations, or from reasoning rightly. And divines, he says, tell us the reason for this is original sin. Okay. I'll give you two more, and then I think you've probably got I hope you will have got the message by then. I'm going to switch across the channel now to say these analyses were not purely characteristic of English thought, although I think certainly they are more characteristic of the English than anyone else. But Pascal is going to make a similar claim. We have an image of truth, so we have in our minds a conception of what is possible. This is a kind of remnant of our Adamic past, but we possess nothing but falsehood. We're incapable of absolute ignorance on the one hand, but we're also incapable of certain knowledge on the other hand. And what this says is that we once enjoyed a degree of perfection from which we are unhappily fallen. So that we have aspirations to perfect knowledge, says Pascal, but we're acutely conscious of the fact that we fall well short of them. And that, he says, is a consequence of the fall. And then finally, the Cartesian philosopher Malebranche, in his most substantial work, The Search After Truth, and I just give you the title here because it's typical of approaches to epistemology of the period. The Search After Truth, wherein are treated the nature of man's mind and the use he must make of it to avoid error in the sciences. So the emphasis on epistemological works of the period is to identify error, and the assumption is that we are naturally prone to error. But once we have an analysis of the causes of error, this then gives us the prospect to ameliorate these difficulties to some degree. But again, Malebranche will say, what this entails then is an investigation of the conditions that Adam first found himself in, and then the disorder that befell him as a consequence of his sin. Once we understand that, once we perform that analysis, we're in a position to set up structures that will ameliorate the difficulties caused by the fall. And what I want to suggest today, that in essence what we see happening in the early modern period is that the structures that we see set up as palliatives to the fall are in essence experimental method is one example, or the more rational approaches to the natural world that we see developed by people like Kepler, Galileo and Descartes, although I won't be discussing those in much detail. Okay, let me just see where I should be by now. All right, so that's, in essence, that gives us the groundwork. This was my starting point, looking at these kinds of passages and seeing how prevalent the discussions of the fall were in the 17th century. Now, what are the reasons that we find this fall discussion front and centre in the literature of the period? And the first thing, and this relates back to my previous book on the Bible and natural science, we have a renewed interest in biblical narratives understood in their literal sense. So if we take a Baconian understanding of our original dominion over nature, for an example, throughout the Middle Ages, the idea of Adam's dominion over the natural world was for the most part internalised and understood as a mastery of reason over the bestial passions within. So the story of Adam's dominion over nature was psychologised in line with the conception of the philosophical life being really about the internal mastery of the passions. When we start to read these narratives in a more literal sense rather than in an allegorical sense, we understand Adam as literally having dominion over the natural order. And we understand, as Bacon will say quite explicitly, the philosophical life now is not merely about getting things right within, a reordering and mental dominion, but rather a dominion that's projected outwards onto the material order. And that's what's quite distinctive about the Baconian vision. And it's partly a function of this turn to a literal sense of biblical narratives and Genesis in particular. The other reason I think that we see a revival of fall and original sin talk in these epistemological contexts is that we see in the 16th and 17th centuries a revival of ancient scepticism, along with indeed other philosophical schools, and this narrative of the fall chimes in very well with the notion that we can't know anything, which is essentially the sceptical thesis, putting it very crudely. And indeed, there's a famous view by Richard Popkin, and I put his name up there, that the whole of 17th century philosophy, well, not the whole of it, but most of it, the epistemological emphasis of the 17th century is a function of a sceptical crisis that's partly caused by this revival of the ancient philosophical traditions of scepticism. The other thing I think that's very important in this context is a revival of Augustinian thought. This happens both in Catholicism and Protestantism, but I think more strongly in Catholicism and Calvinism in particular. It's Catholic manifestations we see in the Jansenist movement, which Pascal was associated with. But the revival of Augustinianism is going to put the question about original sin and its consequences, again, it's going to put that to the front of the agenda. And as we'll see, there are controversies about how we should understand original sin and its consequences. And that's, again, part of the reason why there's an important literature about it. And as I can say, that really brings us to the final point there, that there are competing views about original sin and its consequences, and part of the burden of the book is to say that the solution or the particular approach to original sin that you take will inform your epistemological program. So if you take a fairly negative view of human cognitive powers after the fall, you're going to move more in the line of experimental natural philosophy. If you take a more optimistic view, you're going to be more inclined to be rationalist. Now, I'm not going to develop that second part of the equation too much today, but the general thesis that I want to spell out is that your view about the severity of the fall on our cognitive apparatus will determine the kind of scientific program that you adopt. And I've suggested here that there are competing Augustinian and Thomist views. This is a fairly crude distinction, but we'll say we've got, roughly speaking, a more optimistic and a more pessimistic view of what happens to the human mind as a consequence of the fall. And I'll just put them up because these are the views of Augustine and Aquinas, respectively, that are reprised in the 17th century. So if we want to look at the full Augustinian position, are we deprived as a consequence of the fall, or are we depraved? For Augustine, we are depraved. So it's not merely for Augustine that something is taken away from us in the fall, what Aquinas will later call our supernatural powers, but Augustine also thinks that our original natural capacities were corrupted and depraved as well. And so the take-home message from these quotes here is that part of the consequence of original sin is to approve false things as true and to make mistakes unwittingly, all right, in the realm of knowledge. In other words, the fall has cognitive consequences. The fall has significant consequences for our knowledge. If we look at Aquinas, however, Aquinas wants to say that all that happened in the fall was that we were deprived of supernatural gifts, but our natural gifts remained, and one of those natural gifts was the light of nature. So the light of reason, he says, since it pertains to the species of the rational soul, and this is the classic Aristotelian definition of the human person as a rational animal, since we are rational by nature, says Aquinas, we cannot be deprived of our rationality. And this is a quite different emphasis to that which we find in Augustine, for whom our rationality itself is corrupted as a consequence of the fall. And we're going to get two quite radically different prescriptions for how we can know things as a consequence of these two distinct positions. And we're going to find, for example, someone like Descartes will explicitly invoke the light of nature as a reason for our capacity to have to intuit rational knowledge of the world. Kepler will also make constant reference to the light of nature as the basis for our mathematical knowledge of the natural world. But if you take a more radical Augustinian position, according to which the light of nature was dimmed or put out or completely corrupted as a consequence of the fall, then you're going to be less optimistic about the prospects of that kind of rational intuitive knowledge. Okay? And let's see, I think we're going to see how this might pan out. For example, in the Protestant Reformers. So these two views are going to be discussed by Calvin and Luther. And Luther is fairly clear, I think. You can read this for yourselves. The natural endowments, i.e. reason, did not remain perfect, as the scholastics argued. Okay? As the scholastics argued. and Calvin will say something more or less, the bottom line is the takeaway message: the light of nature is blind or extinguished as a consequence of the fall. And this is set up as an explicit difference between the Protestant position and the scholastic position. And indeed, as we'll see later, this will become a basis for criticising the scholastic appropriation of Aristotle. Because, in a sense, Aristotle and the scholastics are on the same page here, both of them wanting to say our rational capacities are natural, and they will, more or less, if they can run as they're supposed to, they will achieve their natural end, which is a knowledge of the natural world. Okay. So, let's look then at the second of the general points that I want to make, epistemological and methodological implications of the fall, as they're spelt out. And I'm going to put a list of them up here, and we're really going to look at only one of these today. But the first one I've made here, the first point is that these new radical and pessimistic conceptions of our human mental capacities are used as a basis to criticise uncritical Aristotelianism. And Aristotelianism, because it was based on, more or less, observations of nature in its normal course and generalisations based on those observations, this becomes the grounds for criticising Aristotle on two counts. First of all, nature in its normal course is a fallen nature, according to this Calvinist Augustinian Jansenist view, and therefore nature itself may be deceiving us. But more than that, because our natural knowledge-making capacities are wounded, we need to be far more critical than Aristotelians were about the knowledge that we're generating as a consequence of our matter-of-fact observations of the natural world. The fall of nature I've already mentioned. Aristotle knows nothing about either the fall or the fall of the natural world. This is the argument that's made. Therefore, he's simply not critical enough when it comes to generating knowledge of the natural world. As a consequence, then, we move on to the next point. We get new epistemological appeals, not to common sense generalisations of the Aristotelian kind, but appeals to revelation, which will include direct divine inspiration, knowledge of nature derived from the Bible. We get new appeals to reason, justified in terms of the preservation of the light of nature, but these are usually directed in a mathematical direction. We get experimental natural philosophy as a solution, and that's the one I'm going to talk about, and we get all of the above. So some people will argue, yes, we need actually not merely revelation, but reason, experience, and personal inspiration. So, as I said, censure of uncritical Aristotelianism. Let me just give you a couple of quotes here, again from the Reformers. Calvin, the corruption of our nature was unknown to the philosophers, who apart from that weren't too bad, is the essence of the message here. And then he goes on to talk about the classic Calvinist position, which is the total depravity, by which he doesn't necessarily mean we're totally depraved, but that deprivation extends to every part of the human person, that no part is immune from the depraving effects of the fall. And then Martin Luther. Nature can't be understood by human reason after the fall of Adam, as a consequence of which it was perverted. Okay. So Aristotle, in his confidence that we can have demonstrative knowledge of the natural world, he's completely wrong. We can't have knowledge that's logically demonstrable anymore. And here's Pascal, again, giving us this dual aspect of the whole epistemological problem. Here's the issue that we find in the ancient philosophers, says Pascal. Either they recognised our excellence, but they didn't know anything about its corruption, and as a consequence of that they were overconfident. Or, he says, they understood our corruption but not its excellence, and that gives rise to scepticism. And what Pascal sets up is the kind of dual focus that I think is the key aspect of early modern knowledge. The aspiration for a perfect knowledge that is, as it were, a vestige of our original condition. And that's what distinguishes these early modern approaches from ancient scepticism, we don't give up, and we don't give up because there is this conception of the possibility of a perfect knowledge way back in the past. And that's part of what Pascal's saying here. It's clear and explicit in Bacon as well. So we need to steer between scepticism and dogmatism is the essence. And Aristotle was classified as the dogmatic approach, and the ancient skeptics as this, indeed the modern skeptics as well, as the overly pessimistic approach. We've got to strike the middle path is the message that Pascal will give us. Okay. I've got some references on the sheets there to these options where people are opting for divine inspiration and revelation as the only solution to the problem generated by the fall. And they're in sections O and P. And I've also got, as examples of those who say we really need to reinvest in our rational capacities, and I've got some sections there from Descartes and Galileo, both of whom want to argue in different ways that our capacity to construct mathematical, or our capacity to intuit the mathematical structure of the natural world is evidence of the fact that our reason has survived the depredations that came as a consequence of the fall. Okay, so the natural light is preserved, but the natural light is now read in a kind of non-Aristotelian way as giving us a capacity to intuit the mathematical nature of the universe. So these mathematical approaches I will be distinguishing from the experimental approaches that we see typically in 17th century England. I think the rational approaches are under the quotes Q and R on the form. So this brings us then to experimental natural philosophy. And I should be clear here, when I talk about experimental natural philosophy, I'm not simply talking about doing experiments, because people had been doing experiments of various kinds for some time. I'm speaking here rather about a specific approach to the natural world that's very typical of England in the 17th century, although it's exported. And it entails not merely the conducting of experiments, but a range of other things that I'll talk about a little bit further down the track. But I just want to signal to you, we're not simply talking about doing experiments, we're talking about a specific kind of experimental program in this context. And let me give you some of the exemplars who are going to be crucial for this. And Francis Bacon is one. And here he's going to set up the problems that we face when we attempt to engage in knowledge-making enterprises. The universe to the human mind is like a labyrinth, deceitful resemblances of objects and signs, nature's irregular, knotted and entangled. And the way is still to be made by the uncertain light of sense. So here again, the two aspects. Nature itself is fallen and attempts to deceive us, and our senses too are uncertain. Given this, Bacon is going to elaborate a program where we need to extract knowledge from nature aggressively. Okay? And the experimental justifications for the Baconian program is that nature is not going to give us anything. Why? Because of its fallen condition. But by the same token, the senses don't give us unproblematic knowledge either. The senses also need to be disciplined by a particular regimen or a particular method. And for Bacon, this will be the conducting of lots and lots of experiments, focusing on relatively small issues and accumulating knowledge over a long, long period of time. And these are some of the distinctive features of the experimental program that take us beyond simply the conducting of the odd experiment here and there. More on Bacon. He says, some people will praise the human mind, but just as an uneven mirror distorts the rays of objects according to its own figure and section, so the mind, when it receives impressions through the sense, can't be trusted to report them truly, but it forms its own notions and mixes them up. So for Bacon, if we put this together with what we've already got, nature deceives us, the senses are uncertain, and now if we add the mind into the equation as well, the mind will attempt to impose its pattern on the sensory data. and it can't be trusted either. So reason also needs to be brought under a particular kind of discipline. It can't be allowed simply to operate as it normally would, okay, as it hadn't for Aristotle. The Aristotelian conception being, if reason and the senses are allowed to run how they should naturally, then they will achieve the end for which they were designed, so to speak, which is to give us veridical or reliable knowledge. The example from Hooke, which I think is in essence the basic message that I want to convey today, the first part of this we've already seen. Every person from a derived corruption, innate and born with them, and from their converse with others who are similarly corrupted, is subject to slip into certain sorts of errors. Given that, what do we do? Well, says Hooke, these being the dangers in the process of human reason, the remedies of them all can only proceed from the real, the mechanical, and the experimental philosophy. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell, right? That is the smoking gun here. We have fallen condition of reason and the senses, that being the human condition, says Hooke. The only remedy is the experimental natural philosophy, the experimental method as we practice it here in the Royal Society. Now, what I want to suggest is that this is not the only solution proposed, but what prefaces this remark is what's important. The corrupt condition of human nature requires extraordinary measures, not the lackadaisical approach of Aristotelianism that had held sway for so long. Now, theological anthropology and the experimental natural philosophy. All I want to do here is to expand what I've been saying a little more about the Baconian approach and to fill in some of the details of experimental natural philosophy with a view to showing how they are attempts to redress the sorts of problems we've identified as a consequence of the fall. So here are some of the features of the experimental natural philosophy. It's probabilistic rather than demonstrable. For Aristotle, and indeed even for people like Galileo, the scientific ideal was logically demonstrable knowledge that was necessarily true. What we get in the experimental approach is a denial that that kind of knowledge is possible anymore, and a shift away from that to knowledge that at best is probabilistic. Now we see this kind of distinction in the quote that I started with Robert South. Robert South said Adam could actually see consequences dormant in effects dormant in the original causes of things. We can't have that kind of knowledge anymore. As a consequence of the fall, let's give up demonstrable Aristotelian type science and move to a probabilistic model. We have knowledge then of phenomena, things as they appear to us, but we do not penetrate to the essences of things. Again, for Aristotle, true knowledge was a knowledge of essences. Just as for Plato, true knowledge was a knowledge of the forms. That knowledge, again, is now ruled out. We can't have knowledge of essences. We can only have knowledge of phenomena. Now, it should also be said here that if we run with a corpuscular, that is to say, an atomic natural philosophy, it's not sure there is any such thing as essences anymore. So the matter theory that's in place here is another reason for this. Knowledge is corporate and cumulative. So we move away from the conception of the individual philosopher, who is, as it were, a master of wisdom, to the idea that knowledge is to be distributed across a large number of individuals. And more than that, true philosophy, or true natural philosophy, becomes a long-term cumulative process. So Bacon says it's not about individual geniuses, it's about a succession of ordinary wits. Okay? And we need to accumulate knowledge long-term. It's not something that the individual mind alone can master. Knowledge is experimental rather than speculative. And in a sense, this is a way of summarising probably the first 3 points. But the way in which English experimental natural philosophers will typically distinguish themselves, or distinguish their approach, is to say, what characters like Descartes are up to is speculative, but what we're engaged in is experimental, and experimental here in the 17th century sense of being grounded in experience. So experimental has two senses in the 17th century: a technical sense to do with the conducting of experiments, and a more general sense to be anything that's grounded in experience. And there are very interesting parallels in the 17th century between conceptions of experimental religion, and religion is the context in which the word experimental is most used in the 17th century. Connection between experimental religion, which is grounded in experience rather than authoritative things that are handed down from on high. So personal experience is a key thing in experimental religion, and now first-hand experience is a key thing in experimental natural philosophy. And this is contrasted with speculative knowledge that assumes that our minds have the capacity to arrive at knowledge when they're running just on their own steam. The other interesting line here is that our senses fell with the fall. So people like Luther and Glanville, who we had up here before, said that Adam had telescopic vision and microscopic vision. He had the capacity to perceive the smallest and the most distant things in the universe. Right? So what we now have to do to overcome what happened to the senses as a consequence of the fall, we need these devices to supplement our meagre sensory information. So there's a justification for the use of telescopic and microscopic instruments as a consequence of the fact that our senses were seen as having been significantly restricted because of what happened to Adam. As I've said already, that because the natural world is fallen, the fall applies not only to our minds and senses but to nature. We have to investigate nature aggressively, and Bacon, of course, is notorious for this, but part of the reason for Bacon's notion of aggressive, intrusive experimentation is because of his view that the natural world is fallen and resists our efforts to get to know it. In all of this, then, method, and I'm being slightly anachronistic in my use of the term scientific method, but the scientific method is imagined to be a therapeutic regimen, okay, that's designed to overcome the inherent limitation of the mind and the senses. Okay, so that's what experimental natural philosophy is intended to do. To give you, what I hope is a useful analogy, if we think about Augustine's view of politics, I'm going to get to the relevance of this in a moment. Augustine's view of politics was essentially this, that political institutions and the power that they have from God is not necessarily something that is intrinsically good. But given the corruption of human nature, we need human political institutions with their coercive power to bring some sense of stability and peaceful existence to human life on earth. So the justification for political institutions is not that they're intrinsically good, but once we truly understand human nature, we understand that the justification for coercive and often apparently cruel temporal powers is that these are necessitated by human nature. Now, in a sense, the experimental natural philosophy is analogous in a way to political structures. Okay? These political structures are not ideal, but they are necessary. It's necessary to impose them on the human condition and on human beings in corporate settings so that we get them all pointing in the same direction and generating knowledge that's not ideal. It's not knowledge of essences, it's not demonstrative knowledge, but it's the kind of knowledge we need to get by, and again, as Bacon would say, the kind of knowledge we need to improve our material condition here on earth. So there's a kind of parallel between the Augustinian conceptions of the justifications of the state and the Augustinian conceptions of the justifications of this method that we impose on our knowledge-making enterprises. Okay, what are we going to do next? Okay, to wrap it up then, and we're moving from the particular case here of experimental natural philosophy in 17th century England, just to talk about what might be some of the broader implications of this view of mine about the importance of the fall in these epistemological discussions, and how we now think about the history of, modern philosophy and science. What have we got first up? The history of science. I won't say much about the voluntarism thesis, and I won't say much about the Merton thesis when it comes to it, but the voluntarism thesis was essentially a view that the reason people start to investigate the natural world empirically in the 17th century was because of a theological view called voluntarism that says God could have instantiated any range of a number of natural orders. We can't intuit which one he chose. Therefore, in order to find out what particular set of laws that God has put in place in the world, we need to investigate the world empirically. Okay? That's the voluntarism thesis. Now, I don't want to say too much about it. I'm a little bit sceptical about the voluntarism thesis, but at the very least I think we can say that one of the motivations for empirical investigation is not a theological motivation to do with our view about God and his unpredictability, but rather to do with the limitations of the human cognitive apparatus. And experimental natural philosophy then is rather, I think, grounded in theological anthropology, which is to say, a particular view about the fallen condition of human beings and what's necessary as a consequence of that. Right? So, in relation to this voluntarism thesis, if you don't know about it, don't worry too much. But I think it needs to be informed more by this conception of anthropology rather than theology. The Merton thesis is a famous thesis that links Puritanism to the Royal Society and experimental natural philosophy generally. What you can probably tell is, from what I've said so far, is I'm not unsympathetic to this view, albeit for different reasons. I do think there's a link between certain aspects of Protestantism and experimental natural philosophy. They can't be restricted to Protestantism because, as we see with Pascal and Jansenism, we get important Catholic manifestations of this Augustinian position. So it's not restricted to Protestants. But Merton says, here are the characteristics of science: universalism, disinterestedness, communality and organised scepticism. And all I really want to say before I move on, if we look at those last two criteria, communality and organised scepticism, I regard these as being directly informed by these theological considerations about the fallen nature of the human condition. That's why we have to gang together, and that's why we're essentially sceptical about what our senses and reason can tell us. And Merton regards these as characteristic norms of science. Now, it's kind of essentialist view of science, but we can skip over that. All right, moving on then. The history of modern philosophy. Here's a standard view that says Middle Ages focuses on metaphysics. We get a shift to epistemology in the 17th century, and the epistemologists are spread crudely between the rationalists and the empiricists. Descartes kind of personifying the rationalists, and Locke personifying the empiricists, and Kant is the guy who puts it all together at the end, bringing together, okay, Philosophy 101 for you. Now, I suspect it's a little bit more sophisticated than that now in history of philosophy departments, but that's the kind of how I was educated as to how early modern philosophy went. And in essence, what I want to say is that it's this move here. I don't actually think we get a move from metaphysics to epistemology, but insofar as we get this interest in epistemology, what I'm suggesting is that is motivated by this renewed scepticism about human prospects for knowledge, which is the inherent Augustinianism that comes out of, or is partly a function of the Protestant Reformation. And these two, this rationalism and empiricism, the contemporaries would have said speculative and experimental, but these two are actually two different solutions to an epistemological crisis. And what you get on this side of the equation is people who are still arguing for the integrity of the natural life after the fall. And Descartes will explicitly run a Thomist understanding of the fall, insisting on the integrity of natural life, and that's going to promote something like rationalism. If you're sceptical about the integrity of the fall, you're going to end up being something like an empiricist. Now, this is a very, very crude generalisation that I'm making here, but what I want to suggest is that these two emphases, which are interestingly geographically quite distinct, as you can see, part of the explanation for this is to do with different interpretations of the fall and its consequences. Okay. And then finally, I think, science and the age of reason. The third thing I wanted to say about the general history. Some people want to argue that science is grounded in a faith in reason and its powers, and in the inherent intelligibility of the natural world. And that what makes science possible in the 17th century is a renewed rational conception and a renewed belief in the intelligibility of nature. Experimental natural philosophy actually says the opposite on both those grounds. It says, no, we shouldn't have faith in reason, and no, the world as it stands is not intelligible. So experimental natural philosophy is actually grounded on the opposite conception to what we sometimes hear bandied about. And John Locke, I think, is an excellent an excellent exemplar of this scepticism about our rational capacities and our ability to know the world. So he says we might be able to see further into the nature of properties if we're clued up on experimental science. But this is judgment and opinion, not knowledge and certainty. Again, we can't have the Aristotelian kind of knowledge of nature, right? All we can do in our present state of mediocrity, which we are in this world, what the consequence of this mediocrity is that natural philosophy can't even be a true science. It can't be a true science in the Aristotelian sense. So Locke, who's a kind of often put out there as an apostle for the Enlightenment, is deeply sceptical about the prospects of what we can know. We can know bits and pieces, he says, but not a lot. And then to finish again, Locke, the epigraph from his 4th edition of the Essay Concerning Human Understanding, reinforcing the point with this quote from Ecclesiastes: you don't know the works of God who made all things. Right? You might think you do, but you don't, as a consequence of the limitations of the rational mind. And in essence, Locke's Essay Concerning Human Understanding is not a manifesto for reason, but it's a manifesto for this kind of theologically inspired scepticism. Okay, I'll finish there, I think.
Thank you very much, Peter. Well, we've got a good time now. Questions. First one, Peter. Yeah.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for a wonderful talk. I love it.
Do you want to...
I'll just speak very loudly. I just thanked Peter for a wonderful talk. I thought it was terrific. I don't need it.
Who's handling the mic?
Here's my very general question. Let's distinguish the...
It's for the tea.
The first thing I did was to thank Peter for a wonderful talk. And now I'm asking my very general question. My very general question is, let's distinguish claims about, on the one hand, claims about the feebleness of our cognitive powers and the opacity of nature, from all of that plus the idea that there was a time when that didn't apply. Now, on some theories of knowledge, that extra ingredient, the fact that there was a prelapsarian state, is crucial. For example, if you had a kind of Platonic theory of knowledge as recollection, there would have to be a period where you had it all in order for you to remember it now. But my question is, how different would the wonderful list you gave of the 7 features of experimental natural philosophy be if we only went for the first thing? If we only emphasized the feebleness of our powers and the opacity of nature, but didn't make appeal to an earlier state when that didn't apply?
No, it's a good question, Peter. And what I think the crucial tension, I think, is the prospects of the possibility of a recovery. Bacon will say, in some measure, but people like Galileo and Descartes will say, insofar as we can have mathematical knowledge of the natural world, we can know nature as God knows it. So the positive side is what motivates us, what motivates the natural philosopher to get out of bed in the morning, so to speak, is the possibility, at the very least, of a partial recapturing, the Baconian model, or much more optimistic models that say, no, we can actually recover in certain aspects exactly what Adam knew. And I think more than that, Adam actually provides a kind of symbol of the possibility of knowledge. So Bacon will often refer back to Adamic knowledge. Newton himself will refer back to Adamic knowledge. And part of it is the view that not only do we have these present set of limitations that are attendant of a fallen human nature, but we also have a long history of corrupted natural philosophy that's a reflection of that condition, and that what we need to do as a kind of historical exercise, is to get back to an Adamic science. And so there's part of the program will be a studying of ancient texts to see what vestiges of the original science of Adam are still evident in the historical record. And again, we'll see that in Newton, we see that in Bacon's interest in the ancient pagan myths and so on. So the difference it makes, I think, is twofold. First of all, it gives us the motivation to do natural philosophy, and that's what distinguishes these guys from the skeptics who are saying, well, let's just give it up, knowledge is not possible. And we also get this move to the study of the historical sources for evidence of Adamic natural philosophy in ancient writings, and the classic ones are the Corpus Hermeticum and Genesis.
Thank you. Okay. Yes.
Thank you. I'm wondering if adding to your thesis of this conceptual and theoretical revolution is something very pragmatic that you find in three additional thinkers of this period. Cotton Mather, who's watching the disease smallpox start to succumb to the experimental understanding. Milton himself, who feels kind of an impending, something new that is just breaking in, that is paradisal. And then your own Robert Boyle, who, though a great theoretician, great theologian, is seeing things that work, apparatus, pumps, theories of air and water, etc. Do you see that as part of your thesis?
Sure. The fact that we have, I guess for Boyle we need to understand the status of the mechanical aspect of this, not really the experimental natural, but it's the mechanical natural philosophy. But mechanics was typically not part of the speculative sciences, but had a lower status. So part of what you have in if we think back to Locke's recent statement about natural philosophy is not even capable of being made a science. But the flip side of that is what we're able to achieve in natural philosophy with mechanical devices previously despised is a certain level of knowledge and a certain level of material capability. These things were not thought previously to be dignified enough for scientific endeavour. Now they are, because in a sense we've lowered the bar, and we're not after this perfect philosophical rational knowledge of them. We're after a kind of operative natural knowledge. So the mechanical natural philosophy and the practical things are elevated in status insofar as we've lowered our sights now. And then these therefore appear on the horizon of what's a legitimate part of the natural philosophical enterprise. In a way they weren't before. Chris?
I wonder if I could just ask a question about the very specifically English context of a lot of these scientific developments that you're talking about. And the reason I want to do that is that, a long time ago now, I wasn't looking at the philosophy of the 17th century. I tried to begin to understand something about the poetry of the 17th century, and in particular why so many critics of that poetry sort of said, when we look to the background of this, we've got to look to Hermeticism and all sorts of things, and that seemed to be wrong. But what did seem to be worth pursuing, and I even wrote a paper which I finally threw away, didn't submit anywhere, was that the peculiarity of English theology, it seems to me, over that period, was that it was neither completely Augustinian. This is why so many of the continental Protestants said, forget Anglicanism, it's not real. Equally, it didn't have that Aristotelian optimism, but it seemed to strike a balance which to me was very strongly informed by certain patristic perspectives, particularly not only Western patristic, but Eastern patristic perspectives. And I was struck, for instance, by your quotation from Robert South, which it seems to me could come straight out of some of the 4th century Eastern fathers. So my question really is, was there something peculiar about the very specifically English way of striking that balance? And is my hypothesis, if you like, that it was something about the patristic background of the way that English and specifically Anglican theology developed, which actually informed that in the particular way that it did?
No, it's a good question. I think you're right to say we don't have a pure Augustinianism, we don't have a pure Calvinism. And Bacon, I think, is indicative of this. Bacon rejects aspects of extreme Puritanism, although he's raised it very much in a Calvinist context at home, he absorbs enough of it, I think, for it to inform his program. But if you were to say, was Francis Bacon a Calvinist or a Puritan? The answer is clearly no, he's not. Does he represent a pure Augustinian tradition? No, he doesn't. Now, the extent to which it's the particular patristic positions that are important. Certainly, these guys know the fathers so well, and when they're reading the Genesis narratives, they're invoking the hexameral literature, and they're certainly invoking Augustine's commentaries on Genesis, and they're doing so quite explicitly. You mentioned the eastern side of the equation, and there's a great resurgence of interest in Origen in the middle decades of the 17th century, particularly in not this college. College is down the road with the phenomenon of Cambridge Platonism, and that's going to be crucially important too. But that's going to tend to inform a more Platonic approach, and I think that's going to be an approach that's more conducive to the mathematicians. But the importance about Platonism and Origen's version of it is that he does bring together Platonic conceptions of a fall with Christian conceptions of a fall, and here the idea is that the fall took place as a consequence of when, for example, the Bible talks about Adam's eyes being opened. Okay, this for Origen and indeed for Philo of Alexandria is that for the first time they had sensory knowledge rather than rational knowledge. So the fall of nature is associated with sensory knowledge. And again, we find a strand of this in Augustine, that it's our attachment to material things that is the ongoing legacy of the fall, and our tendency to privilege sensory information, which to some extent cuts against the grain of the experimental natural philosophy. But that is very strong in Malebranche, interestingly. And Malebranche will say, as a consequence of the fall, we've been enslaved to sensory objects. And that's why we actually have to adopt the rational Cartesian approach rather than the experimental natural philosophical one. But you're right that the exegesis of the fathers is throughout all of these readings of Adam. But as I say, it does tend to be cut in slightly different ways. And the Eastern fathers, for the most part, their approach is going to be more conducive to something like the continental approach than to... That's the Cambridge Platonists notwithstanding. Okay. There's probably a bit more work to be done there, but thanks for your question.
Okay, we've got a question back here.
Thanks. All your talk, you've been talking about interpretations of the doctrine of the fall in the Christian world, both in Reformed churches and the Catholic world. And I wonder how the other notion related to the fall, which is Christian notion of redemption, fits into the picture in different ways, obviously, in the Reformed world and in the Catholic world.
Again, it's a good question, and it's whether our redemption consists in the sorts of active engagement with the natural world that we're now promoted to do. And we do see this in Bacon. That very first quote he gave, he said, we fell from our natural perfection and our dominion over nature. We can fix up human nature with religion, and we fix up our dominion with the sciences. So you have this twofold approach to redemption, in a sense, that religion does its part, but that the active re-establishment of dominion over nature is part of the redemptive process itself. And I think that becomes a crucial motivation then for the pursuit of science. But what science needs to recommend itself in this period, again, crudely speaking, it's not self-evidently the way you approach the natural world to do all these experiments. And you see this explicitly in continental criticisms of English experimental method. It just seems all too hard. So how do we get social legitimacy for these counterintuitive approaches to the natural world? And I suggest that Aristotelian is a very intuitive way to approach nature. Experimental natural philosophy is not. Part of how we get legitimation for this is to say it's part of a religious redemptive activity designed to bring about a re-establishment of dominion over nature. So, and this is the kind of Arminian aspect, I suppose, and this is why they're not pure Calvinists and they're not pure Augustinians, because there's an incipient Arminianism in this notion that we participate in the redemptive process ourselves. So there's a kind of tension there between the signs of election that means we get active in commercial and scientific enterprises, and the fact that in so doing we're actually contributing to the redemption of the world and ourselves in it.
I'm conscious of time's up. I think time for one more quick question. That's one here, and then we should pull some. Yes, please. Yes. Oh, okay. Never mind. Okay.
Just wondering, with this question of redemption after the fall, you haven't mentioned, or it's not been discussed, the double-sidedness of science, all the good things it's done. But I wonder, in relation to the fall, how you would comment on the horrors, as it were, that science has brought us. The threat of nuclear war, apparently global warming and climate change, all the bad things that are being done with computers. I find this sort of doesn't quite fit into this picture. Thank you.
No,
it's a big question. I can't.
It's
just in 2 minutes, Peter. It should be simple.
In 2 minutes. Well, in a sense, it gets us back to the Lynn White Jr. thesis about Christianity being responsible for environmental degradation. Now, Lynn White is right insofar as if we buy this model that these conceptions of theological anthropology promote an active engagement with the natural world, then clearly, as well as bringing the boons of science, they bring us the downside as well. You can't cut it both ways. But I would say to people who propose the Lynn White Jr. thesis, that is to say Christianity is responsible for environmental degradation, if you say that, you're also committed to the view that Christianity is responsible for the means by which that's accomplished, which is to say it feeds into the scientific enterprise. But I'm completely neutral with respect to whether the scientific enterprise, generally speaking, is a good thing or not. My argument is not that isn't this the best thing that's happened. It may be, it may not be. You can make up your own minds about that. But what I'm more interested in saying, here are the ideological origins of, or part of the ideological origins of this approach to the natural world. It's very Western and very distinctive, I think.
Well, thank you, Peter, very much indeed. I think we should finish, so I know people have got to get on. So, first of all, let's thank Peter very much for a great talk. Very